Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled ScottMadden's Energy Industry Update, Money, Money, Money. A few housekeeping notes we would like to mention. We acknowledge that given the current higher demands on internet connections, where many are working from home, technical issues may be more pronounced. If for any reason we find the need to restart the event, we invite you to click your same link to rejoin the event. In such case, we will also resend the links via email. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we will have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the question interface on your screen. Now I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Kristen Lyons, partner and energy practice leader with ScottMadden. Kristen, welcome to the event and you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Money, Money, Money. I'm Kristen Lyons and I lead ScottMadden's energy practice. Next slide, please. ScottMadden is a general management consulting firm that specializes in energy. We work across the energy value chain to operationalize strategic imperatives. To that end, we bring innovative, thoughtful solutions to our clients' biggest challenges in generation, transmission and distribution, grid edge, rates and regulation, energy markets, and corporate services. So if you're not familiar with our work, reach out. We'd love to talk to you. For those of you who aren't familiar with our energy industry update, it's a semi-annual publication that updates you on what we consider to be the most important issues in our industry today. You can view an interactive version or download a copy at ScottMadden.com. So to today's topic, we entitled this issue of our EIU, Money, 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 because that's what everybody's talking about right now. We'll start off with energy cost and affordability, then we'll move into integrated distribution planning, and we'll finish the discussion with the Inflation Reduction Act. At the end, we will have time to take some questions. Next slide, please. Our first topic is cost and affordability. We're seeing projections for significant capital expenditures to support the clean energy transition, continued inflationary pressures, and volatile gas prices. All of these are factors forcing the industry to consider where energy costs land, and importantly, how this is going to impact our customers. Next slide, please. Talha Sheikh, who you can see side by side, is going to lead this discussion. He's a director in our Raleigh office, and he's been with us for more than 7 years, consulting specifically in the energy space in regulatory with electric, gas, and water utilities. So Talha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. As Kristen mentioned, in this section, we will be exploring the challenges of cost and affordability for the utility customers that they're facing today and they will be facing in the future. And these concerns will really be at the forefront for the utilities, regulators, and stakeholders as we continue to progress towards a clean energy future while ensuring safe and reliable service. Next slide, please. So we start with taking a look at the historical price trends. In the past 50 years, the electric prices have increased at a generally consistent pace compared to inflation. Now, that has not always been the case. So, for example, during the shale gas revolution time period from 2011 to 2020, the electric prices increased slower than inflation. So, for example, the electric prices increased by 1%, while the inflation increased by 2%. And that was really driven by the low natural gas prices that we were experiencing. And then there have also been time periods in the past where the electric prices have outpaced inflation. So, for example, during the global financial crisis or during the Hurricane Katrina times. And recently, we're looking at a similar trend from 2020 to 2022. Electric prices have again outstripped or outpaced the overall consumer prices. And so there are two drivers that we wanted to explore in this webinar and we explore in our EIU. One of them being infrastructure investments and the other one being the rising natural gas prices. Next slide, please. So starting with the infrastructure investments from the utilities, we're seeing a significant expansion in utility investments really in all elements of the electricity value chain. So that would be generation, transmission, and distribution. And in many cases, these investments are mandated by the federal and state governments. So for example, on the generation side, we're looking at utilities adding new resources, both dispatchable, variable, emitting, non-emitting. We're also looking at investments to increase gas interconnections and pilot new technologies like hydrogen, advanced nuclear, or storage. On the transmission and system operations side, we're looking at utilities and transmission providers really focusing on expanding regional footprints, interconnecting renewables, and a broad range of reliability and resilience related investments. And then on the distribution side, the focus really is on building a grid which is optimal for accommodating the clean energy goals. So for example, that includes grid modernization or system upgrades to accommodate increased electrification, adding storage, non-wires alternatives, and really expanding energy efficiency and demand response. Now, noteworthy on electrification and demand response, these could be wildcards for the future in terms of the rate impact. So for example, if electrification is managed such that it does not result in system constraints and it actually increases or improves the system utilization, then it may end up reducing rates for all customers. However, it's too early to say what those benefits would look like. And as discussed, they really depend on how the electrification is managed. Next slide, please. The second area driver of the prices is really natural gas prices, and these have a substantial impact on customer rates since a large portion of our power generation is gas-fired. Now, recently we have experienced higher prices due to higher power generation demand, lower inventories, and global LNG demands. Now, utilities do have some hedging strategies. For example, rolling over the prices over a 12-month period. But as these hedges expire and the utilities roll over at higher price levels, then the customers would experience higher rate impacts. Now, the question is, would this trend continue? The actuals in this chart actually are through August 2022, and there has been some easing recently in September and October. This line has gone down a little bit, but still the question remains if the prices are going to stabilize at a higher level or lower level. So for example, if the prices stabilize at higher levels that were experienced in August, then the affordability impact would be higher on the customers, and they may not have capacity to absorb rate increases coming from the higher utility investments. At the same time, if the natural gas prices stabilize at levels at a lower levels, which we have experienced in the past, then the affordability impact may ease up. Next slide, please. So how do we measure affordability? One of the ways we could measure affordability is looking at the percentage of income that the US households are spending on electricity. Now, looking at this chart, the yellow line represents the middle income quintile, the average household, which is spending almost 3% of income on electricity, which is moderate overall. But if we look at other income levels, so for example, the lowest income quintile, which is the light blue line at the top, they are spending almost 9% of income on electricity bills. And these customers would really be the most vulnerable as the utilities increase the spending on infrastructure, and we continue to progress towards the clean energy goals. So moving forward, the regulators and utilities will have to closely monitor affordability in the rate proceedings and other proceedings, with added dimensions of looking at different customer segments, income levels, and geographic areas. So for example, we are seeing an increased focus on equity in programs, such as separate spending budgets approved for energy efficiency programs, which are focused on disadvantaged communities and including lower income households. So similarly, the affordability concerns could drive changes in how the low-income programs or energy assistance programs are designed and implemented, and really focusing on alternative rate-making measures so that the rate impact on the customers could be mitigated in the future. So at the end of the day, the policymakers and utilities would have to balance achieving policy objectives with affordability concerns. Next slide, please. Now, what may help the affordability concerns? The Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed by the president in August, this includes $369 billion in investments and incentives designed to significantly lower the cost to manufacture and deploy clean energy technologies. And this will be discussed by Paul Quinlan later in this session. But one early analysis of the IRA assumes that the focus on renewable energy investments will shield electricity customers from volatility in natural gas prices as the focus shifts from gas-fired generation to more renewable generation. And that may lead to lower bills for customers. So the analysis shows that the IRA is expected to reduce electricity prices between 5% and 7% in the next decade, which translates to around annual savings of $200 on electricity bills for the average US household. However, again, it is still unclear and still early to determine whether these interactions between the government incentives, utility investment requirements, and the impact on fuel prices or natural gas prices will work to reduce rates or not. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways, number one is the cost and affordability impact in the short term and the long term really depends on two types of drivers. One is the internal, so for example, the utility investments as we have discussed, the policy initiatives, the clean energy goals. And then the other one is the external factors like natural gas prices or global events like global supply chain issues coming from the pandemic or the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So the utilities and regulators would really need to monitor both of these type of drivers when it comes to addressing affordability concerns. Now, there may be wildcards, as we have discussed. So for example, if the natural gas prices are transitory and they stabilize at levels which we have experienced in the past, for example, during the shale revolution, then the near-term pressure on rates may ease up. At the same time, the IRA might help reduce cost related to clean energy investments. And then electrification and demand response, really, if they're managed in a way that they don't result in system constraints, rather they result in improved system utilization, they may also temper rate increases. But again, too early to say if those benefits are going to be achieved or not. So at the end of the day, regulators, utilities, and the stakeholders will need to strike a balance between achieving policy objectives and ensuring safe, reliable, and affordable service. Thank you, and back to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Talha. Next slide, please. Our next topic is integrated distribution planning. The manner in which we're planning and spending money in the distribution system is changing, driven by everything from reliability and resiliency to clean energy and environmental justice. States across the country are using distribution planning to meet a variety of objectives, a very different approach than we had just 10 years ago. Next slide, please. Josh Kimmich, who is a director in our Raleigh office, is going to lead this discussion. Josh has been with the firm for about 8 years, and much of this time has been spent working with clients on issues at the grid edge, whether that be distribution planning, EVs, energy storage, or the regulatory implications of these programs. Josh?
Thanks very much, Kristen. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about integrated distribution planning, what that can mean, and some of the main challenges that we're seeing utilities face in both the planning and developing plans for regulators and their customers. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the figure here, over the past 10 years, we've seen steady growth in both transmission and distribution investment. And there's a number of drivers there, partially just replacement of aging infrastructure, system expansion where the areas where there have been load growth, new technologies being added to the system, all of which drives that kind of steady increase in spend. When we look forward to the next 10 years, we expect all those things to continue to drive growth in spend, but also start to layer in some of the policy goals that Talha, you mentioned, specifically the integration of renewables at utility scale on the transmission side, as well as the integration of distributed energy resources on the distribution side, and electrification, both electric vehicles as well as for the heating of buildings, both residential and commercial, all of which will likely add to the need for increased investment in transmission and distribution, as we'll talk about a bit more here. And with that in mind, we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions and regulators look to utilities to provide maybe a longer range and more robust and more integrated distribution plan to both lay out the roadmap for those investments and also how the utility is going to meet certain policy goals. Next slide, please. So the effect elements of an integrated distribution plan, it's going to vary pretty widely by jurisdiction and state, and there's a lot of different factors, but there are some elements we see that are maybe not common across all, but fairly typical. Again, these tend to be driven by the regulatory environment and the policy goals, some kind of overarching goals, like I mentioned, the integration of DER, electrification in all its forms, and also permeated throughout. More and more, we're seeing an aspect of equity being factored into how planning takes place and how these plans come together. Of course, none of these exist in a silo, kind of hence the integrated planning, and there's a lot of interrelation between them. Maybe starting off in the top left, when you think about a distribution plan, there's that traditional core investments in utilities, system expansion, maybe storm hardening, replacing of aging infrastructure, and I'd also add in there what you might call some smart grid or grid mod investments, specifically devices and technologies on the system that make it more flexible or allow more information to come back to the control room, to the utility. While those are newer, I think we're at a place where utilities the investment's not to make in those types of things, but how is it expanded or replacing with the next generation? And when you put all that together, when we look at most utilities' distribution plans, that's a big chunk of it from a dollar perspective. However, that's the core, and there's a lot of emphasis within these plans on how the utility is meeting other goals, which bring in a lot of other elements. Looking at tools and systems, this could be communication or other systems that help enable that more kind of flexible grid, allow for more control, more visibility, and that supports both those traditional core aims and also more advanced capabilities to enable other things such as DER. And that, again, can take the place of communications infrastructure, different systems. More and more, we're seeing advanced distribution management systems. And looking ahead, there's certainly a lot of talk of DER management systems as well. Thinking about planning and forecasting, again, in the context of some of these policy goals, we're seeing regulators and increasingly stakeholders looking for more kind of thought or rigor around, say, forecasts related to DER and electrification, and not just what do we think DER looks like, say, in 5 years on the system or the impact of electrification, but scenarios to that effect and how do those affect the utilities' plans. And as mentioned, when looking at forecasting and planning, more and more we're seeing requirements for stakeholder input throughout the process. And I think that's true for forecasting and planning, but also kind of throughout the integrated distribution planning process, stakeholders are playing a larger and larger role. And finally, there's and I think has been for a while, a lot of talk of non-wires alternatives. And as we think about how the utility plans the system, considering non-traditional solutions, typically distributed energy resources to defer maybe a traditional infrastructure investment, that is being more and more integrated into the planning process to identify and potentially execute on those types of projects. Speaking of DER, which in many cases is, if not central, a key feature of some jurisdictions' integrated distribution plans. And the first step there, and I think this is very common, is to focus on hosted capacity analysis and making maps available. So at a minimum, developers can understand where there could be capacity on the system, allowing more efficient siting of DER, and that in turn makes the interconnection process easier. Along with that, when you can start to think about some more advanced capabilities that include sharing of data to better enable DER, and ultimately monitoring and control or utilization of DER as a resource, potentially utilizing a DER management system to do that. So all these things kind of are, can be factors in looking at how DER relates to the overall distribution plan. Now, kind of all the things you talked about, obviously there's cost associated, and it's an increased cost. And as Talha was, went through in detail, affordability is also more and more a factor that goes into or influences these plans. And part of a way to justify costs or prioritize costs would be benefit cost analysis or certain cost effectiveness tests. And we're seeing these integrated into the planning as well, specifically to evaluate non-traditional solutions, whether that's the non-wires alternatives or maybe investments that are specifically designed to enable DER, and looking at what benefits, well, obviously the cost, but also what benefits are brought by those investments, both potentially in cost savings, but in some cases those could be societal benefits, both qualitative and quantitative. And a second aspect of that is defining where those benefits may take place on the system. And that could be where, what value does DER bring to the distribution system, or also in the lens of equity and affordability, again, which we're seeing more and more, are these benefits being delivered to, say, disadvantaged communities or other places where the utility is trying to focus those benefits, and how do you even define that? So obviously a lot of challenges there and a lot of aspects to the understanding cost effectiveness for these plans. And finally, electrification is certainly an interesting aspect of integrated distribution plans. First, because it can be a goal and also a driver. A goal in the sense that some jurisdictions are looking to utilities to lay out plans on how they will support electrification goals, and that can be EV charging make-ready programs or incentives to convert from gas or fossil fuel heating in buildings to electric. But it's also a driver in the sense that depending on the pace of electrification in certain jurisdictions could certainly bring not just increased load, and that obviously impacts the entire distribution plan, but also the way that load shows up in both time of day and season certainly has an impact on the distribution plan, especially the further out you look. So it's kind of a interesting aspect that as we see more electrification incentives and more of that impact start to show up, I think becomes central to a lot of these plans. Next slide, please. And so, as mentioned, it really, the regulatory policy goals within a specific state or jurisdiction really drive requirements for different plans. And just on the screen here, or chart here, you see just a snapshot of how that certainly varies by jurisdiction. And I'd add these are evolving all the time to meet new policies, to maybe address more localized or jurisdictional changes to legislation, or storm impacts. All those things shape what regulators ask for between whatever interval for distribution plans. Next slide, please. So along with those different aspects comes some, I think what we've seen is common challenges across integrated distribution planning. First, simply these are new objectives for grid planning. So from the utilities perspective, that has been traditionally focused on providing safe and reliable service, planning towards system peak in that one summer, in some cases winter day, or handful of days throughout the year, and planning the system that way. Well, now they're introducing these different aspects such as DER, which is having varied impacts on the system, or electrification that changes what peak may look like and when it happens and how often. All those things certainly complicate the grid planning process, not to mention adding in these other objectives, the stakeholder input. All of those together both make it more complex and may require more resources from the utility in order to understand these and marry up some of the different goals. Similar or along the same lines, the kind of integrated aspect of integrated distribution plan can certainly be challenging. There's across many utilities some aspects of the different parts of the plan when we think of customer-facing programs versus planning infrastructure in the distribution system. Some of those within a utility could be siloed or typically don't have continuous interaction, and integrated distribution planning, as the name suggests, drives some of that interaction, or it can be challenging to marry up different plans and understand the impacts of, say, a far expanded customer program for conversion to electric heating. What does that mean for planning at a granular level down to substation and circuits, and how does that impact the long-term plan for infrastructure in different areas? Those things have to start to come together, and that's not always as easy as it sounds for organizations that haven't done that in the past. Again, affordability is certainly a challenge. Talha covered it extensively, and there's certainly this juxtaposition of what the utilities are being asked to do all these new things, which none of them don't come with a price tag, but also still provide affordable rates to customers. And that's obviously not going away anytime soon. When you think about inflation, add in natural gas prices and how that'll impact rates, even for deregulated markets, that overall bill price tag is going to impact what regulators are willing to approve for or ask of utilities in terms of increased spend. And so to balance that, as we talked about, benefit cost frameworks and benefit cost tests help certainly justify and prioritize different investments. This is a case where the devil's in the details of what are those values. How do you quantify societal benefits, say CO2 reduction or greenhouse gas reduction, or the locational value of rooftop solar on the system? How do you value that? How do you calculate that? All those questions are extremely difficult, and the jurisdictions that have even started to address that have certainly struggled to get to an answer that makes sense, that everybody agrees upon, and is not overly complex. So that challenge certainly remains. And speaking of benefits, also understanding where in the service territory those benefits are realized, and with an increased focus on equity, going back to a lot of the focus is on integration of DER, electrification. Well, if we think about rooftop solar or adoption of EVs today, that tends to be folks that own a home and can afford those costs, so we're now starting to talk about a subset of customers that in most cases be considered middle class, upper middle class. So from an equity perspective, with all these policies focused there, regulators are asking how are we ensuring that benefits are realized by all customers, and certainly in a lot of cases disadvantaged communities. And that's that's a hard question to answer and understand when you're making investments across the system, system-wide investments. How is that allocated to a specific place, or how do programs benefit communities even if the infrastructure may not be specifically in that community? So very tough questions. And then finally, we're seeing in a lot of these plans or adjacent to these plans, utility performance metrics. And these can be usually to help metrics measuring if utilities are meeting policy goals or supporting policy goals. And those can be symmetrical, where there are incentives, financial incentives and penalties, or even just where there's positive incentives. It still changes the way that the utility has to think about plans and programs in order to meet its obligations, but also keep in mind where there could be additional earning opportunities, and how do you deploy capital or O&M to meet that, or just change processes in order to meet those goals. So a lot of different challenges, a lot of unanswered questions that are part of just how distribution planning is changing. Next slide, please. So in terms of key takeaways, I think generally when we think about distribution planning, it's becoming more and more complex. First, we're continuing to see increased T&D investment, and that is both that baseline core system expansion, replacing aging infrastructure, adding new technologies, but also increasing with the introduction of policy goals or requirements, such as integrating DER, electrification, both in the additional capacity and also ways the grid may need to change to account for what electrification looks like on the system. And as I think is kind of talked throughout, we're seeing the integrated distribution plans as policy vehicles. And that runs the spectrum, certainly, but more and more in certain jurisdictions, the requirements for the plan are designed to demonstrate how the utility is working to support policy goals. And sometimes there are, in fact, incentives to do so. And again, the other side of that coin is also pressure to keep rates affordable and justify costs and define what affordability means, and then also ensuring that those investments have equitable benefits across the service territory. So as we discussed, many challenges remain, and I think you can summarize that as a lot of these concepts make sense, and you'll see, and there's some really kind of smart research papers written about them and presentations, but the devil is really in the details and in the implementation of figuring out how this works in practice. And I think that's where we are right now in a lot of different ways of understanding internally how the utility coordinates to meet these goals, to plan in a different way, and externally with stakeholders, regulators, maybe developers when we think about DER. How does that fit into the planning? And then on the other side, there's still a whole lot of work to be done about defining benefits, justifying costs, and understanding how these programs serve all customers. So a lot of challenges remain. It's a very interesting time for distribution, and over the next 10 years, I think we'll see continued evolution in how distribution systems are planned. With that, back to you, Kristen.
All right. Thanks very much, Josh. Next slide, please. Our last topic is the Inflation Reduction Act, and this act has received tremendous attention based on its potential to bolster clean energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and strengthen domestic industry and supply chains. To say there's a lot there is an understatement. Next slide, please. To speak to this topic, we have Paul Quinlan, who is a clean tech manager in our Raleigh office. He is energy and utility clients with market research, strategic and business planning, modeling, and due diligence evaluations. And I can say personally, when we see policy changes impacting the clean energy sector, Paul is the first person I go to. So with that, it's all yours, Paul.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about the money that exists in the Inflation Reduction Act. And two notes before we get started, as everyone's probably aware at this point, the bill is massive in scope with lots of different provisions. And so the focus of my comments today will be more on the implications rather than walking through all the different parts of the bill. Second thing to note is how we got here. This is the bill that never died. As folks go back in time, in 2020, one of Biden's campaign promises was Build Back Better. And this had a price tag of over $2 trillion. And that was going to fund energy priorities, climate priorities, as well as social issues. And so some of those got picked up and passed in the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act in November 2021. But then the energy and climate pieces looked dead in mid-July when Senator Manchin basically said those were not going to be included in a budget reconciliation bill. And then in late July, after some clandestine meetings between Senators Manchin and Schumer, there was an announcement that they had reached an agreement. And I still remember exactly where I was when that announcement came across on my phone because everyone had left this bill for dead at this point. And 3 weeks after that, after passing both the House and the Senate, President Biden signed it. So next slide, please. So to give a sense, a high level of where it's at, as I mentioned, this was passed through the budget reconciliation process. That requires all the activities to occur at a 10-year time horizon and has to be paid for. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see where the savings and new revenues coming from in order to pay for it. There's some new revenue. The big one here is a 15% corporate minimum tax, and this is applied to companies that make over $1 billion in profits and provide that to shareholders. And then also savings from some drug price negotiations. And then and what you'll notice here is that much of this is related to taxes and healthcare. That's where a lot of the savings and revenue is coming from. When you move to the right hand of the slide, you'll see where the money is being spent. And so you will notice quickly that green is the prominent color here. So a lot of this money is going to energy and climate. A few of the big ones of note is the clean electricity tax credits. Basically, with simplification, this restores the full ITC and PTC and expands these tax credits over time to both standalone storage as well as net zero carbon technologies. Another big one that's included and actually not noted in the headline number here is the DOE Loan Program Office. Their lending authority was increased, and as some new programs were also added to their purview as well. So that's an opportunity for loan guarantees. And then finally, note at a high level, the EV tax credit. That has added some complexity. There's requirements now on vehicle prices, income restrictions, content requirements. I expect this one will be messy and frustrating for consumers, especially in the near term, but that's a big piece of the legislation as well. One thing I want to stress on this slide is that you're looking at educated guesses. The spending is on the right-hand side is largely coming out of the Congressional Budget Office. So they're estimating what this bill, what the tax credits would be, what levels they would come in at, and it's unclear whether those estimates are accurate. Credit Suisse has put out a note saying that many of these tax credits are uncapped, meaning there's not a dollar limit or that is cuts them off. And so they estimate that spending could actually exceed 100 or 800 billion over time, which is more than double what the CBO put this at. Next slide, please. So in terms of implications, what does this all mean? As noted, the IRA is both sweeping in scope and scale, and there's really three things that come out and emerge across the bill when you look at it as a whole. The first is that there's a strategic approach to focus on reducing costs. Historically, climate and energy has been addressed through federal policy with sticks. If you think cap and trade or the Clean Power Plan, making things more expensive to encourage behavior elsewhere. What this bill does instead is it provides massive tax credits to just about everything. It's tax credits along the entire supply chain and focused in on zero carbon technologies, energy efficiency, building electrification. So there's a lot of carrots. One analogy is think of a mile-long train with carrots spilling out of every rail car at every railroad crossing that it goes through. So different approach, and ultimately this bill got passed with the carrots. Second is that the desired outcome centers on rapid decarbonization. All the provisions, climate and energy provisions in this bill really accelerate the clean energy transition by deploying unprecedented policy support. It's not only all the carrots, but how long those carrots exist. So many of the tax credits will last at least 10 years. And so for an industry, for renewables at least, having tax credits continually expire, this provides a lot of certainty to go forward with plans and move forward. There's also focus on new emerging technologies. So it provides money for both SMRs, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration technologies. So an ability to really use all the tools in the toolbox, both existing and emerging, to address decarbonization. And then the third item to note is there's a real direct and strong approach to shape domestic industrial policy. Many of the provisions require components to come from onshored or resources from free trade partners. So for the one example is for manufacturing, there's a production tax credit for the making of various renewable and battery components in the United States. The PTC and ITC for electric generation, both of those include bonus tax credits for domestic content. And then the EV tax credits, as I mentioned, have a component that ties to domestic manufacturing, focused in on battery components as well as critical minerals. Next slide, please. To look at this another way and kind of put all this into context is this chart from Rocky Mountain Institute, I think does a great job of showing that we have no historical comparison for this, the impact of this bill. What you're seeing here on this graph is a federal spending on climate-related spending over the last, going all the way back to 1990. In the first two bars here, you'll see it's largely tax expenditures and agency spending. When you move into 2009, it changes. There's a light blue bar. This was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, and that was considered a very big deal for the energy space back when that passed in 2009, 2010 time period and implemented thereafter. And if you look at the final bar, this is what has been passed under the Biden administration. It's not just the investment, the IRA, but also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is part of that, as well as CHIPS and the Science Act, which provides a lot of money for R&D. And so we're looking at a scale of federal spending that is unparalleled and will have potentially a significant impact going forward. Next slide, please. In terms of looking at, I mentioned decarbonization as a clear goal of this bill, you'll see that it does move the needle on this metric as well. So the blue bars or blue shading on the top of this chart is where we were on prior policy. So a central estimate from the Rhodium Group is that it would our emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. would decline about 30%. With the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act, that is expected to decrease about 40%. So that still is not on target with the U.S. Paris Agreement 2030 targets, but significantly lower than the track that we were on prior to the IRA. Next slide, please. One of the questions that we had come in during Taha's speech was, where is the money going to go and what generation is going to get built? I think this chart here shows a good estimate of what may come down the future. What you're seeing here is annual capital investment in the energy supply related infrastructure. If you look at the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see 2024 to 2035, and this is an estimate from the repeat project at Princeton before the IRA was passed. And this picks up investments that were in the IIJA. And when you move to the right, this looks at the inclusion of the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's a couple things that jump out real quick. Those bluer bars, wind and solar, increased dramatically. But it's not just that. If you look at the teal at the very bottom, that's transmission spending. So that's an important, or has significantly more, especially on the back year, since transmission takes a while to plan and construct. But then also as well, some of the purpley colors, you've got carbon capture and sequestration in there, you have hydrogen in there, and also some nuclear. So a lot of capital expected to be deployed as a result of the IRA. Next slide, please. So as a few final takeaways here, it's maybe these are the things that we see that are very important. One, first thing, everything has changed. If you watched Top Gun this summer and you had any sort of business or strategic plan at that time, it's probably has assumptions that are outdated at this point. There's so much money and the scope and scale of the incentives are so large, any sort of assumptions may be off at this point because of the IRA. And then for energy companies as well, the challenge will also be identifying and prioritizing which money to pursue. There's so many buckets. The expectation is that companies will not be able to pursue everything. And so really figuring out what's going to have a positive impact on your business model and pursuing those buckets of money will be important going forward. Second, here you'll see increased complexity. The landscape is now completely different. We have bonus credits. There's an ability potentially to stack across different incentives that are in the IRA. And so now is the time to begin to prepare and organize for this increased complexity. And modeling, I think, is a good way to think about this. Historically, the ITC or the PTC was a static number, but now with a bunch of bonuses, something like that needs to be updated in models for project finance and or IRP models, and then have an ability to include different amounts for what used to be static tax credits. And finally, the things that we are watching now is the IRA implementation and permitting reform. So federal agencies are moving very quickly to implement the IRA. There's also talk that the EPA may develop new power sector regulations to further limit greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel plants. And they have greater authority to do that with the recent Supreme Court ruling, which was West Virginia versus EPA. They can do things within the fence line, and that is fair game. And then finally, as part of the Schumer-Manchin deal, there was an agreement to pass energy permitting reform. And so originally this was going to be put onto budget at the end of September, but that was not included. But now there is talk of including that on the National Defense Authorization Act or an end of the year omnibus spending bill. So that is not totally dead, but that would, in theory, remove some of the permitting challenges for transmission as well as natural gas pipelines. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Kristen.
Thank you very much, Paul. And if I could have my panelists join me on camera. So we have gotten a number of questions as the conversation has evolved. And I'm going to start off with one that came in for Talha early on. So Talha, the question was whether, just scrolling through our texts here, whether the past and forecast investments are the net after the investment tax credit. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So this probably pertains to slide 6 that we discussed. There were two types of increases that were shown. One was the past rate cases, and one was the pending. And this goes a little bit to what Paul said, that everything has changed. So on the pending rate cases, as the IRA is kicking in, if the utilities had not incorporated the assumptions of the IRA in the forecasted rate increases, then they would need to be updated. It could happen during the rate cases, or it could happen in the future proceedings. So, for example, after the 2017 Tax Act, there were adjustments to rates that the commissions approved in proceedings separate from the rate cases. So that's a good question. In the future, these rate increases might get adjusted a little bit.
So I've heard that we're looking at up to a year to get all of those assumptions related to IRA baked into scenarios, IRPs, rate cases, et cetera. Paul, I know you've thought a little bit about this. Thoughts for timing when we might see those updated?
From what I've heard from folks that run models, it's about what it may take to fully integrate. And then you have the question, once when you have the flexibility, what is the right numbers to put in? If you think of IRP planning, one of the tax credits bonuses is tied to location if it's in an energy community. So you may have some projects that exist in an energy community, others that do not, and then those projects would receive different tax credits. So modeling that accurately even once when the models are updated mechanically, will still be probably additional complexity that we haven't had before.
Seeing as you just brought it up, can you spend just a minute talking about how that stacking of incentives might work under the IRA?
Certainly. There's a lot of different provisions, and what may be most interesting is how companies leverage different tax credits. So a potential example to think about that is the clean electricity investment tax credit will become available in 2025. You may have the option to build an SMR at that point. If you put it in an energy community, that could be 50%. And then from there, there's a new program with the DOE Loan Program Office. You would have an ability to get a loan guarantee to possibly convert an old coal plant to an SMR. That's called Program 1706. That has a loan authority of up to $250 billion. And then if you get really creative, there's money from the USDA to support cooperatives. There could be an ability to have the PPA, the cooperative be the counterparty, and the PPA be supported by the USDA money. So I expect creative financing has long been a part of this industry, especially with renewables and emerging technologies. And I expect that will continue as folks figure out the different pieces of the IRA and how to put them together.
Thanks for that. So one question that came in was regarding stakeholder participation in utility IDP processes. So Josh, are we seeing municipalities, especially those with sustainability goals, participating in these?
We are, definitely, and I think those are explicit goals for some jurisdictions that set stakeholder participation. What that looks like certainly varies by the municipality, both kind of income level. In more municipalities that have more disadvantaged communities, it's more about reliability and maybe realizing benefits like from community solar, where others could be like, for example, working with the utility to understand what's needed for a planned electric bus fleet, things like that. I think it also varies by size, where, you know, we talk about municipalities, but large cities have much more sophisticated goals, but also ways to interact with the utility, and have probably been doing so for a longer period of time. So that interaction looks different, you know, through rate cases and things like that. So that interaction definitely looks different. And I guess the last thing I'd add is sometimes both municipalities and utilities don't know what they can actually do for each other. I mean, each has goals and what they need to accomplish, but kind of understanding where they can help each other. A lot are still figuring out where that middle ground is and what they're able to do and ask for.
So while we're on IDPs, can you talk a little bit about how they've evolved the last few years? Because they've been out there for a while, but it seems we're starting to see new elements in states where perhaps we haven't had IDPs before, or changing requirements as we move forward.
Sure. I think there's probably two things in the past 5 years or so. If looking back, IDPs were somewhat driven by the integration of DER, just asking what is needed to make this a grid that can best utilize the benefits of DER, two-way power flows, what are the foundational investments needed for that? And also, how can DER maybe defer or supplement traditional investments in infrastructure investments? And that was in a world where there was flat or very low load growth. I think with the introduction of electrification and the potential impacts of that, we're not that all those factors thinking about DER don't matter, but things like non-wires alternatives get a lot tougher when your load growth isn't just a little bit, but with heating electrification or transportation in some places, it starts to blow the opportunities for NWAs out of the water. And so it shifts the focus to some extent on what's in an IDP, from maybe just looking ways to save money with DER, but how do we spend money to meet all these policy goals? And then the other piece of that, which is the other side of the coin, is things about affordability and equity. We're seeing that more and more in requirements throughout IDPs, and trying to balance those two.
So do you think we're going to continue to see non-wires alternatives show up in IDPs? You mentioned they're more difficult when we've got a lot of load growth.
So my opinion, yes, I think they will continue to show up in IDPs. And I think they will continue to be very challenging to actually execute on, because it becomes this sweet spot where there's hypothetically an area that only is having a little bit of load growth, but needs a lot of investment to address that growth. And maybe that's where DER, like a battery storage, makes sense. But with electrification, those have become fewer and fewer. And I think we look to New York, which in their distribution system implementation plans, they lay out potential NWA, non-wires alternatives. And you can look on various utilities websites of what have gone out for RFP and what have received or have gone forward as an NWA, that it's only a fraction of the ones that they put out to bid. And I think that's probably going to be consistent with a lot of other jurisdictions' experience. They're not going anywhere, but probably not a lot of them showing up.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. So Talha, as you think about all of the challenges that we have in terms of infrastructure investment, inflation, et cetera, plus net zero goals that are going to require so much investment across the system, how do we start to move in that direction without overburdening customers?
So on the electric side, the challenges are real on both electric and gas side, right? To move towards net zero goals without overburdening the customers. The costs are real. You know, the clean energy IRA is going to help, but there's still infrastructure requirements that are going to be implemented. But then there are wildcards that we talked about. So, and Paul and Josh have also talked about, for example, on the electric side, if the transition is managed in a way that it doesn't constrain the system too much, and if there is improved system utilization, then the impact on rates might be tempered. On the gas side, again, challenges are real. There's the renewable natural gas, which is a good alternative for natural gas. Conventional natural gas is really expensive. So there's a technology breakthrough and it becomes a more cheaper alternative, then that would be the way to go. And at the same time, there are some wild cards. So for example, natural gas infrastructure can be used to provide benefits of electric peak reduction, which we are seeing in Canada, for example. There's a program where we're looking at a decarbonization program in Quebec, where Hydro-Quebec and Énergir are partnering up, where the gas utility is really implementing a program that provides benefits, electric peak reduction benefits during winter peak events. So those kind of things also provide some relief or an optimal way to move towards net zero objectives without overburdening the customers too much.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more and more of those. Thank you for that. So I think we're down to the last question, and it'll be one from our audience. This goes to Paul. What is your estimate for the U.S. to get to net zero by 2050? IRA and the infrastructure bill barely touch the potential costs. Thoughts there?
There's one provision that I think is interesting in the electricity tax credits, both the PTC and ITC. They are set to expire in 2032, but there's also a provision that if we have not hit a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from electric generation, those tax credits will continue. I think it was NextEra who said that they estimate the tax credits could keep going to 2040. So in terms of paying for it, these are now written into law. It would take Congress to unwrite them, and there is some provisions tied to decarbonization that will keep them going until those are met.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we are just at time. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt. Thank you very much. To the extent that we didn't get to your question, please feel free to reach out to my team and me, and we would be happy to have a conversation. Matt?
Thank you again, speakers, and great presentation all. For our audience, we hope you have enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so that we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This concludes our presentation.